Namaskar, Nilesh Oak here. In this episode, we are going to discuss, deliberate, and leave some guidance for those individuals who have either asked this question or who have raised uh, doubts or concerns about what I said in a podcast with Ranveer Alabadia. The podcast was about Bhagwan Krishna, his lifetime. You can think of this as a scientific biography of Bhagwan Krishna or life and times of Bhagwan Krishna in a purely historical sense. I mean, there is no other sense. It was a great episode. Let me actually jump into the presentation, okay? And so it would be easy to uh, refer to them and talk about specific points. So, the key, if I have to summarize it in the sense of what the bigger issue is that I would like to discuss, is essentially Gokul versus Vrindavan. Are they two different places, or is it just one place? What is or where is their exact locations of Gokul, of Vrindavan, of today, but also during the Krishna's time? And do these descriptions match or help us corroborate the evidence, the descriptions that are given in the Harivansha, which is a attachment, a Khila Parva, an appendix to Mahabharata, and then also in the Bhagavad Puran. There are many other Puranas where Krishna's Leela are being discussed. We are not going to refer to them. Okay, so let's begin with this issue of Gokul versus Vrindavan. This can be seen if you go to YouTube and look at this podcast between me and Ranveer, the TRS, the Ranveer Show. It has already crossed 3 million plus views. And so there I discussed evidence from these three texts that I just described as it related to life and times of Bhagwan Krishna. Before we jump into this issue of Gokul versus Vrindavan, let us look at the agreed upon chronology of early years of Krishna. A clear, I wouldn't call it a disclaimer, a clear what do I want to call it? A clear statement I want to make here. This slide, the few points, what it shows, there is no confusion, no arguments whatsoever about it. However, it's always possible to find someone who is hanging on to some other dogmatic vibe, and you know what? They have every right to stick to. But there is no point they arguing against it and wasting my time and wasting other folks' times. So this, you can think of this as a background knowledge. That is something we are all going to agree to for this discussion, take it for granted, because there is no confusion as far as these three texts are concerned. There are no counterpoints, okay? There are no counter narrations. So bullet number 1, Krishna killed Kamsa when Krishna was 11 years old, approximately 11 years old. Bullet number 2, until this time Krishna lived in Gokul plus Vrindavan. And the reason I am saying this is because that is the question. Is Gokul and Vrindavan the same place or different places? Where exactly they were, how far they are, and the descriptions from Harivansha and Bhagavad Puran, do they corroborate these locations? Okay, or the descriptions, can they be corroborated using the current location of Gokul and current location of Vrindavan, or there are some other places such as, for example, the Mathura itself, Krishna Janmasthan, as well as Govardhan Parvat. All right, bullet number 3, Krishna, along with Nanda Yashoda, relocated within the Vraja region when he was 7 years old. Okay, this is something we are not going to debate. And the last one, the details, at least the lunar calendar details as they relate to the birth of Bhagwan Krishna. The lunar month and a tithi at the time of Krishna's birth is Shravan Vadya Ashtami. Nakshatra Rohini. Notice Nakshatra Rohini is the same whether you use a Amanta system or Purnamanta system. Now in Purnamanta system, which is broadly speaking, crudely, broadly and roughly speaking, prominent or in vogue, in use in the northern India. Amanta system, broadly speaking, again in the use in the southern India. The government of India in most cases uses Amanta system, just for reference. So per Purnamanta system, again this is not a discourse on the calendar, guys. So I'm just going to briefly say it. Purnamanta means Purnima to Purnima, that's the one lunar month. Amanta means Amavasya to Amavasya. Per Purnamanta system, the Krishna's birth, exactly the same tithi, same timing, everything same nakshatra, but it will be called a Bhadrapada Vadya Ashtami. It is just a nomenclature thing. Now, lazy people just make a big deal out of it. Instead of, when I say Shravan Vadya Ashtami, instead of saying, why is he consistently saying this? Maybe my understanding is wrong, meaning the person who is raising that question, and just look at a couple of Panchang and it will be clear. But no, they have to write it and they have to keep on repeatedly say this thing, okay? Most of my research, unless I say otherwise, I use Amanta system. So next time anyone has a confusion, just go back, look at the Amanta and Purnamanta system. So we are going to take this as a background knowledge as it relates to the issue of Gokul versus Vrindavan, okay? Now we begin with the evidence, or we begin with the reference that is well established. For example, when I started my research on when did the Mahabharata war happen, well, that was the question which was not answered. That is not so anymore. That is not so anymore in general, but that is definitely not so if we are discussing Bhagwan Krishna. So I'm not going to every time repeat this evidence, but just to give you an idea, this is the kind of solid evidence we have from the Mahabharata text itself. If you just look at the numbering from 1 to 10, this is very high level discussion of AV observation, Bhisma's duration, destruction of Krishna's Dwarka, that is the oceanography, sedimentology type of evidence, then evidence of Y chromosomes bottleneck, that is the genetics types of evidence. There are a lot other types of evidence that I have not discussed, such as climatology, which is related to descriptions of river Saraswati. I've just mentioned it as a one line. There are 200 plus descriptions of river Saraswati in the Mahabharata, or physical anthropology evidence, on and on. And then back to the astronomy, just like the AV observation or Bhishma duration and so on. 40 different moon descriptions, 6 descriptions of Saturn, 4 descriptions of Jupiter, 8 descriptions of Mars, 6 descriptions of Venus. I have done a typo there. And again, 8 descriptions of Mercury. All of this consistently taking everyone to 5561 BC. And then, number of you who may be already aware, if not, every reason to grab a book by Jeevan Rao. In English, it's called Yuganta. In Marathi, it is called Kali Yugacha Arambha by Jeevan Rao, about the beginning of Kali Yuga. And 90 plus descriptions from Mahabharata plus Harivansh and from Purana, it leads you to only one unique date, 2nd November 5561 BCE. If you are still stuck into the wrong information dogma of 3102 BC as a beginning of a Kali Yuga, it's time to discard it. Now, whether you are able, capable, intelligent enough to do it, I'll leave it to you. Now, beyond Mahabharata text, there are different evidence that comes from different places. Now, keep this in mind. This is directional and approximate. Okay, so we are not going to look at this evidence and point to a specific year like 5561 BC. The evidence doesn't lead to that. But what it does, if you look at Megasthenes Indica, and the genealogy of Indian kings that are given, and some of the identification of some specific individuals, you can estimate the timing of Mahabharata to be around 5770 BCE, which is very close to 5561 BCE. If you look at Mahabharata Nirnayamrut, not to confuse with Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnaya of Madhvacharya, this is a text that no longer is around, but the shlok from this Nirnayamruta text are quoted by many great Indian Mahabharata dating researchers as well as Indian astronomers, where it is stated that the summer solstice was in Virgo, which is Nakshatra Chitra, think of this, at the time of Mahabharata war. Again, if you use that information, it takes you to the time period of 7000 BC plus from there to 4000 BCE. Shadashiti is one interesting astronomy phenomenon. It is described in Mahabharata Vanaparva. You combine that with Surya Siddhanta, because Surya Siddhanta provides additional information which is not given in the Mahabharata. It combined information will also take you to the same time period. You can look at the screen, 6500 BC through 4500 BCE. The Skanda Purana genealogy, the timing between Parikshit and Mahapadmananda, and then if you take along with this the other recent efforts in determining the timing of Mahapadma Chanakya about like a 1600 1700 BCE, then using the Skanda Purana genealogy, it takes you to about 5000 BCE, very close to 5561 BCE. And then the calibration of the equation of the sun, especially with pulsating epicycles and its latest calibration. When I say latest calibration, don't get fooled. The latest calibration for the equation of the sun in Surya Siddhanta happened at the time of Mahabharata war, around at the time of Mahabharata, not so much the war, 5500 BC. So we are going to start with this information. Now remember, when I was trying to find out the date of Mahabharata war, this was the problem we were trying to solve. Now that we have solved the problem, this becomes part of the background information. So now we want to go further and see what else we can find out. Remember the tetradic schema, P1, TT, EE and P2. When we solve this first problem, and there is a time for celebration, but then it leads to, especially if it's revolutionary, it leads to bigger problems of higher complexity. So, then the question is, all right, so now we know when did the Mahabharata war happen, and we also have information right inside the Mahabharata text saying 36 years after the Mahabharata war, Krishna's Dwarka was flooded and destroyed, and I have demonstrated phenomenal evidence, a global event, evidence from every single place you can imagine around the world, showing a sudden sea level rise. Okay, of course, including Dwarka and the east coast of India and Indonesia and Turkey, the Black Sea, the Great Barrier Reef, the West Indies, the eastern coast of Maine and the Mississippi Delta, you just name it, all the way to Europe and so on. Okay, so now we know that is the time Krishna completed his earthly existence. He left his body, and that was the year 5525 BC. Great. So we know when he left his body, we know when he participated into the Mahabharata war, that's 5561 BC. What else do we know as it relates to the chronology or his lifetime? And so no additional information was forthcoming from the Mahabharata text. And so that's when you go outside. Okay, and so Hari Vansha, literally the word means Vansha of a Hari, the genealogy of a Hari, as in Krishna. So that is one book which is the appendix to Mahabharata. And then there is a Bhagavad Puran, again dedicated to Leela of Bhagwan Krishna. So those are the two texts we are looking at, and actually, as it happens, I'm discussing these two because the evidence from them is actually very useful. I found it useful, sufficient to put forward the entire chronology of the life and times of Bhagwan Krishna. What I'm showing you here is from a Hari Vansha. This is the description of a conversation between Andaka and Kamsa just at the time, just before Krishna killed Kamsa. And these are again astronomy descriptions beginning with shlok number 25 and going all the way to, let's see, to 28. Okay, And I'll just save time. I have done this before. You can listen to scientific biography of Krishna at Sangam Talks, or many of my talks on Bhagwan Krishna at my own channel Nilesh, or of course a wonderful podcast with Ranveer Allahabadia. Okay, one of that shlok, which is again an extremely unique, extremely powerful observation, is that Ketuna number 27. Ketuna Dhuma Ketostu Nakshatrani Trayodasha Bharanyadini Bhinnani Nanu Yanti Nishakaram. And this is that simulation I'm showing you here. Okay, starting with the Bharani, that is the brightest spot of the comet. The comet was covering the entire visible sky, practically 13 nakshatras, and it was so bright that, as if in a poetic sense, the writer of the Harivamsha is saying that the moon couldn't find its path, or its path was, what you call, very bright, in the sense, the way we say, headlight, deer and headlight kind of scenario. It's a poetic thing. The point is, it was the apparition of this comet was extremely bright and extremely vast, covering 13 nakshatras, and even very specific information. Its brightest spot began with Bharani nakshatra. This is a very, very unique occurrence, especially in the context of what we know about the timing of Mahabharata and so on. Okay, so just wonderful thing. So we know this is the time when Krishna killed Kamsa, and Bhagavad Puran tells us Krishna was 11 years old at the time when he killed Kamsa. So if you take 5622 BC plus 11 years, that gives us 5633 BC. Then we know when Krishna was born, which is Shravan Vadya Ashtami. Now, no one should have a problem. If you have a problem, guys, you came to a wrong talk. Maybe you do not have the ability to comprehend. You can just go do something else more useful. Okay, so don't confuse between the Amanta and Purnamanta system. Understand them so that the confusion doesn't remain. All right, so Shravana Vadya Ashtami, that's when Krishna is born, and we get that. Again, to clear our doubts, we use this doubt clearing machine. Keep in mind, anytime we are proposing a solution, trying to share that with somebody as a Pararth Hanuman, trying to explain it to someone, we must able to fill in all these 5 places in the middle, Pancha Avayava, in the language of Nyaya Darshana, and of course should able to clearly state what problem we are trying to solve, and if we have succeeded in solving that problem, we should able to state clearly what is our solution, okay, in a scientific and logical fashion. So let's use that. So for example, we looked at the evidence from, I hope I'm showing the same slides, yes. So we looked at the evidence from Mahabharata, Harivamsha, Bhagavad Puran, and what kind of evidence? We had astronomy evidence there, climatology evidence there, and we are going to briefly discuss that, and a chronology type of evidence, and it allowed us to draw the conclusion that Bhagwan Krishna's lifetime was from 5633 BC to 5525 BC, 107 years. And lo and behold, I have given a whole talk, multiple talks, also a podcast with Ranveer, that how I arrived at this 107 years timeline. And to my pleasant surprise, okay, if we look at the Dvaita Sampradaya, the Vaishnava, Vedanta Dvaita Sampradaya of Madhvacharya, and in his book Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnay, I don't know how he arrived at that conclusion, but he says that Bhagwan Krishna lived for 107 years. Saptamabdam Shatottaram. Okay, now what we are doing is, let's start with this Bhagwan Krishna's lifetime as the background knowledge. Now it has become a background knowledge. And now, so we are not going to question now the year of Mahabharata war for this discussion. We are not going to question the timeline of Bhagwan Krishna. And now, holding that as a part of a background knowledge, now we are going to ask the question, if this is the time of Bhagwan Krishna, do we find any additional evidence from any of these 3 texts that also matches, that we might have missed so far? And why we might have missed? Because until then we did not know exactly when he was born and so on. Okay, or if you go back like 15 plus years, we did not even know for sure when did the Mahabharata war happen. So let's start with the lifetime of Bhagwan Krishna. Then we may ask a question. Again, this is the beauty of this extremely robust the logic of scientific method framework, the doubt clearing machine. There are these three corner points of the triangle, and then of course the theory at the top and background knowledge at the bottom. The beautiful thing is you can start at any of these 5 points, and then start and find out something that you don't know much about. Start from the known, start from something that is established, a hypothesis or a theory which has turned now into a siddhanta, well established thing, and then try to know more about the things that are not known. For example, so now we ask the question, if that is the timing of Bhagwan Krishna, we are not doubting it, we know it, but this is the way of formulating things. Do we have factual descriptions, additional factual descriptions to match 6th millennium BC? And then in after that we may start searching for it. In Harivansha, we get these two sets of descriptions, and we are going to actually look at them briefly. One is just after Bhagwan Krishna is born, so think of that as a year 5633 BCE. Vasudeva takes Krishna to Nanda and Yashoda, and then Nanda comes to meet Vasudeva another day, just few days after. And as Nanda is walking, there is a description of course, he is walking. Just remember these descriptions, guys, okay? And you will see what is its connection with the Gokul versus Vrindavan confusion that thousands and thousands of you have, that you wrote in your comments, in the comments to that podcast between me and Ranveer on lifetimes of Krishna. One is that the Nanda, as he walks along the bank of river Yamuna, he sees Govardhan Parvat, he sees cows grazing on Govardhan Parvat and so on. But he also sees in his path his feet falling into dry cow dung. Very important. And remember, what is that time? It's just after the birth of Krishna, immediately, like the next day or so. And it is the lunar month of Shravana. Okay? Now, what is its significance? Of course, you should know. That's why you asked that question, but we will discuss briefly. The next thing is he also sees trees cut and stacked at the villages or at the border of the villages. That also is a secondary, but also has some significance related to the timing of the lunar month of Shravan, the timing of Krishna's birth with respect to the season. Now let's look at Gokul versus Vrindavan. Now before we go there, let's understand whether they are two places or one places. The Gokul or Vrindavan is contained within this broader area called Braja or Vraja or Brijabhumi or Vrajabhumi. You can pause the video and read this description to understand how far or how big is this Vrajabhumi. Okay, let's move further. Now we come to this Gokul versus Vrindavan. Listen carefully, and if before asking questions, maybe listen to this 3-4 times. Okay. Notice the location of Krishna's Janmasthan. Okay, this is here. This is from Google Maps. Okay, this is right here in Mathura. Now the confusion and all this discussion and back and forth type of comments related to Vrindavan or Gokul. Did Vasudeva cross the Yamuna river when he took Bhagwan Krishna from his birthplace to Yashoda and so on? Okay, so for now, the way we identify the location, this is the birthplace of Bhagwan Krishna in Mathura. And going further south or somewhat eastward and south, you can say, this is river Yamuna. You can see the path of the river Yamuna. And one has to cross river Yamuna, and then you come to a place called Gokul in the area of a Mahaban. Okay, so this is what we call Gokul today. On the other hand, from the Krishna's birthplace, if you start going in the sort of a north direction, then you are going to come to a place called Vrindavan. Just keep that in mind. Okay, this is very important. Don't forget it. So are those two different places? Well, yes, today they are described as two different places in two different directions with respect to the birthplace of Krishna. Keep that in mind. Only in one of the two places you have to cross the river Yamuna, the way Yamuna flows today. Okay. And if it is a Vrindavan, you do not, from birthplace of Krishna, you do not have to cross Yamuna, at least the path of Yamuna today. That's what we are saying, okay? Just keep that in mind. Let's go to the next one. Now the things get more interesting and therefore confusing. So, what did we see on the previous slide? We looked at Gokul here in the Mahaban, okay, on the other side of Yamuna. From there, if you come, now these are the roads, and one doesn't have to follow the roads, and there is this Vrindavan here, and in between there is Mathura, where is the birthplace of Bhagwan Krishna. This is our Yamuna, okay, the way it is flowing today anyways. Now in this context, notice couple other places, maybe 3 places. One is the further west of all these 3 places is Govardhan mountain, and then if you from there you go further north, first you are going to hit Barsana, the place of Radha Devi, and then you go further north, and here at Pavan Sarovar you end up with Nadagaon, Nandagram. Just keep that in mind, okay? So the question is, how many different places Nanda lived, and what is the significance of his Nandagram, what is the significance of Vrindavan, and what is the significance of Gokul. Stay alert, things get very interesting. Now what you see on the left side are the descriptions from Harivansha. Think of this as a day after Bhagwan Krishna is born, and Vasudev has taken Bhagwan Krishna in the middle of night from Mathura to Gokul, okay? Now, so just for our discussion, this is not an easy narration, but to Gokul, and many people, because in the comments, many people said, hey, you know what, Vasudev has to cross Yamuna, so let's go with that description. It only occurs in Bhagavad Puran out of the 3 texts that we are discussing. Okay, so Vasudev takes Bhagwan Krishna, comes here and crosses Yamuna and comes to the Gokul and exchanges the baby and goes back to Mathura. The next day, Nanda comes to visit Vasudev. Now keep in mind, Vasudev and Devaki are not literally in the prison, but they are in a house arrest, okay? So now what happens? Now let's look at the descriptions of Nanda and listen very carefully. I mean, if you say, oh yeah, so what's the problem, then you did not understand any of this. As Nanda leaves Gokul and comes to meet Vasudev in Mathura, and the description says, Shlok number 16, he says, it's in Hindi translation, so I'll read that. फिर यमुना जी के किनारे किनारे जाने वाले ऐसे एकांत मार्ग से वे चले जहाँ जल की बहुतायत थी और ठंडी ठंडी हवा चल रही थी. So 2 possibilities, either Nanda crossed Yamuna first and going along the bank of river Yamuna until he comes to Mathura, or he might be going along the eastern side of Yamuna until he comes to Mathura, then crosses the river. Now look at the next verse. So far so good. Next verse it says, गोवर्धन के निकटवर्ती शुभ्र प्रदेश में पहुंचकर उन्होंने गवों का व्रज देखा. Now गवों का व्रज is very important, you understand. Gokul is a word, simply means a place where there are lot of cows together. Okay, that's all it means, guys. Okay, even by definition, but let's move on. गोवर्धन के निकटवर्ती शुभ प्रदेश में पहुंचकर उन्होंने गौओं का व्रज देखा जो यमुना जी के तट से जुड़ा हुआ था और शीतल वायु उसकी सेवा करती थी. Now do you see the challenge here? So Vasudev is going along the river Yamuna, but then he says गोवर्धन के निकटवर्ती शुभ प्रदेश में पहुंचकर, so he reached the area near Govardhan. Now remember, Mathura is here, Gokul, we are assuming it's here. He's starting along the bank of Yamuna. Govardhan is far, far away from it, especially with respect to Mathura. So why is he going close to Govardhan? That's number 1. Now that's when the interpretation comes into picture. For example, we may say, maybe, just trying to make sense of this without changing it, maybe he can see Govardhan from a distance and he can even see the cows grazing and so on, and maybe that's what the description is. Okay, I'm just giving you this as an illustration how sometimes we have to not change the meaning but change the interpretation to make a sense, to make sense of what is written. Because otherwise, Nanda coming all the way to Govardhan on his way to Mathura does not make sense. Keep in mind, ceteris paribus, keeping the current places and assuming them to be the same places 7,500 years plus ago. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is the two references I referred to on the previous couple of pages. चकड़ों की गोलाकार श्रेणियों से वहाँ का भूभाग बहुत विशाल जान पड़ता था, which is possibly near Govardhan he is referring. Again, my point is, Nanda can see it from a distance, just to give a benefit of doubt there. वहाँ चारों ओर कांटों के बाड़ लगे थे, सीमाओं पर जंगल के गिरे हुए बड़े बड़े वृक्ष रखे गए थे. This is what I am referring to. This is a pre-monsoon type of preparation for the rainy season. Or for the pre-cultivation preparation work in the agriculture. Okay, so that's when people would do such a thing, like collecting the wood stuff to burn, or collecting wood to use for cooking purposes, and definitely doing it and storing it properly before rainy season begins. Okay, and the last one, बछड़ों के लिए गाड़े गए खूंटों और बांधने की रस्सियों से उस व्रज की बड़ी शोभा हो रही थी. वहाँ धरती पर सब ओर, now on the ground, if there is a dry cow dung fallen, that Vasudev is not going to see in the Govardhan area, so we are going to say that it is along his path, along the bank of Yamuna. And the most important thing is that cow dung was dry. Okay, and so that has an implication for the season. But what happens is, so do we know the exact location? Yeah, we will look at this. So first one, but sorry, let me just go back for a second. So what happens is, some fools, trolls, okay, but people with high degrees but absolutely no sense of scientific acumen or no skills in logic, will literally puts their own confusion, nonsense into my mouth. For example, they will say, oh, based on these descriptions that the trees were cut and they were stacked along the borders of the villages, or as Nanda or Vasudev walked along, their feet fell down into, or their feet touched the dry cow dung. Therefore, I say, at the time of Bhagwan Krishna's birth and lunar month of Shravan, it was the season of a Grishma. Nonsense. How stupid is that? I'm not saying anything like this. I have established that the Mahabharata war happened in 5561 BCE. 36 years after that, I have established with oceanography evidence from around the world that how there is extremely powerful evidence, and how that such a evidence does not exist. In fact, a counter evidence exists for this whole 3000 BC nonsensical time interval that dozens of people have proposed for timing of Mahabharata. So 5561 BCE as a timing of Mahabharata, and therefore Krishna is given. And at that time, if anyone looks at the seasonal location of the lunar month of Shravan, they will know it is early Grishma. So that's done. Now what I am saying, which lok number 2324 evidence, is that this evidence also tends to support the previous conclusion that the lunar month of Shravan is during the early Grishma. This is called corroboration in science. Unfortunately, those people who have no sense of Vijnana Buddhi, no sense of Tarka Shastra, no sense of scientific acumen, no sense of logical reasoning skills, deliberately create utter nonsensical statements to confuse the sincere and ordinary folks who do not understand these details. So keep that in mind. Okay, this is a corroborative evidence, tends to support, it's not required, but it is there. Therefore, it is my duty to bring it to everyone's attention. Now keep this in mind. Remember, Nandagram is here, Barsana is kind of on the way towards Govardhan. Now just in terms of distances, so that you have a feel for this. Okay, from this Pavan Sarovar Nadagaon via Barsana coming to Govardhan, and it's practically straight line, is about 30 kilometers. Now if you go from Govardhan to Vrindavan like this, my guess about 20-25 kilometers. From Govardhan straight to Krishna Janmabhoomi place about 20 kilometers, and from Krishna Janmabhoomi place down to Gokul is about 15 kilometers. So you get some idea, okay? And this further could be 6 to 10 kilometers here in Vrindavan, okay? Straight line may be less, okay? Now, do we know exact locations? Now, how many of you knew that? I mean, somebody will say, what do you mean? What do you mean if we know exact location? Aha! If you are asking that question, you are ready for a surprise. I hope you are ready. You better be ready for a surprise. Okay, what about Gokul? Today we are looking at Gokul or Gokul right here, south of Bhagwan Krishna's birthplace and the other side of Yamuna. Okay, that is the location of Gokul. Do you know something? This particular place as Gokul was identified not that long ago, which is to say the actual locations of Vrindavan and Gokul, and those are simply lost to our cultural memory. Now, in comparison to these, the birthplace of Bhagwan Krishna is well preserved. Okay, maybe because it is right in the city of Mathura, and also possibly because that's where it was the dynasty, Yadu dynasty, is ruled from. On the other hand, the Vrindavan or Gokul and Nadagaon, they had less significance after Bhagwan Krishna left these places and came to Mathura and eventually to Dwarka. That could be the reason. Again, that's not the subject today. The fact remains that Vallabhacharya, who established a Pushti Marga, you might have heard, philosophically speaking, Shuddha Advaita Sampradaya, in 1550, around 1550, which is to say about 500, 600 years ago, less than 600 years ago, he came to this Vraja area, and these all places were practically lost to our social, cultural, dharmic memory. And he went and very likely looking at the descriptions of Bhagavad Puran in the sense of it has to be other side of Yamuna river, because Vasudeva has to cross the river, in comparison to the birthplace of Bhagwan Krishna, which was well known 600 years ago or even 2000 years ago. We can find historical records for the birthplace of Krishna. So he went there, he crossed Yamuna, where he felt like, this sounds to me like a Gokul. That's where he said, this appears to be Gokul, let's celebrate and re-establish the place. Okay, what is the story for Vrindavan? If you look at Vrindavan, similar story, only difference is instead of Vallabhacharya of a Pushti Marga following Shuddha Advaita, now this time it is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu following Achintya Bhedabhed philosophy, simultaneously one and different, and possibly his 6 disciples, 6 Goswami. Okay, a number of you may know this. Vande Rupa Sanatano Raghuyugo Sri Jiva Gopalako, Jiva Goswami, Rupa Goswami, Sanatan Goswami. Okay, 2 Raghunath Goswami, Raghunath Bhatta, and then Gopal Bhatta Goswami. Okay, and maybe Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. So he went around, he came from Bengal to Vrindavan, and in search of the places related to the pastimes of Bhagwan Krishna, where he felt, maybe intuitively or maybe based on the information that was available with the locals, maybe information available to the Grantha at that time, which we may or may not have today. Whatever the sources he had access to, he rediscovered, he established that what we now call Vrindavan today is actually discovered or rediscovered by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu again about 500, 600 years ago. Surprised? Get ready for more surprises. Okay, so now that's why these are 2 different places. Now what else do we know? Now against this background, look at the conflicting narrations from the early years of Krishna. Number 1, the season at the time of Krishna's birth. If people are going to read Bhagavad Puran descriptions and stay very simplistic, not use much of their brain, what descriptions comes to their mind? When Bhagwan Krishna is born, there is a heavy rain going on, and then Vasudeva takes him on his shoulder or head, walks towards Gokul. He comes to Yamuna. Yamuna is again flooding, and he crosses Yamuna, and magically, you might have heard the story that water was rising, but when Bhagwan Krishna's little baby feet touched the water receded, and so on. You might have heard the story. That story does not exist in Mahabharata, it does not exist in Harivamsha, it does not exist in Bhagavad Puran. It possibly exists in many other Puranas. Bhagavad Puran does talk about Vasudeva crossing the river Yamuna and coming to Nanda's place. Keep that in mind, Gokul versus Vrindavan. We are going to come to that confusion also. But the season may appear to be Varsha if you only stick to Bhagavad Puran. But what I'm saying is the entire evidence of the Mahabharata text, the evidence of Harivamsha, and even frankly Bhagavad Puran goes against this assumption of Varsha season. So then the question is, was it a late Grishma, was it early Grishma? And based on the enormous evidence, I will say it was the timing of early Grishma. Think of this as the early part or a significant part of the month of May in today's time. Okay? That should give you a feel for how it would have appeared when Bhagwan Krishna was born, the lunar month of Shravan. Second bullet, was there heavy rain at the time of Krishna's birth? And you know what people suggested there into the comments? They said, okay, Nilesh, I accept, I like your work, and I know how meticulous you are, and how empirical and how scientific and how logical you are. But is there not a possibility that, there could be a untimely heavy rain? Absolutely. I'm not saying there was an untimely heavy rain. I'm not saying that it was not there. Guys, this is not relevant to my thesis. My thesis is that the lunar month of Shravan came during early Grishma. Only in that context I was giving the evidence of Nanda walking over a dry cow dung, or the trees cut and stacked along the borders of the villages and so on. Okay, so yes, there can be untimely rain. Okay, the next one. Was there heavy flood in Yamuna at the time of Krishna's birth? Well, the untimely rain can cause a flood, but also even without the rain, the glaciers melting, and that can also cause flood during a peak of summer, which was that early Grishma time. And so there can be a flood. Again, I'm not saying there was a flood. I'm not saying that there was no flood. It's not relevant to what the point I am trying to emphasize, namely lunar month of Shravan was during early Grishma, and therefore 6th millennium BC at the time of the birth of Bhagwan Krishna. Now bullet number 4. Did Vasudeva cross river Yamuna to reach the place of Nanda? Hey, Bhagavad Puran says so. Okay, there is not all that magical dramatic thing, but definitely he crossed. There are 2 lines. Please go and read Bhagavad Puran, for heaven's sakes. There is just one shlok where he just crossed the river. That's it. Okay. Now Harivamsha doesn't discuss this, but just because Harivamsha does not discuss, remember, we have to stick with the Tarka Shastra. Just because it doesn't discuss it doesn't mean it did not happen. Okay, but the point is there is less discussion of a flood, less discussion of a rain that needs to happen in the context of early Grishma, unless it was untimely rain or a flood due to melting of glaciers and so on. Now this is an open discussion. These are the questions that the people who feel so passionate about, emotionally, dogmatically, in the Shraddha, in the Bhakti, doesn't matter, they should take this as their research subject and not just point fingers in a very lazy and tamasic fashion at others. Okay, let's look at the last bullet. What are the locations of Nanda's Gokul and Vrindavan? Well, we looked at today's locations of Gokul and Vrindavan. The Gokul was identified, discovered or rediscovered by Vallabhacharya about 500-600 years ago, and the location of Vrindavan was identified, discovered, rediscovered by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu again about 500 or 600 years ago. Until then they were lost to our dharmic, cultural, social memory. Not so with the birthplace of Bhagwan Krishna. Okay, thank Krishna for that. Okay, so these are the 2 places. And so now the question we have to ask is, can one resolve the conflict? Of course we can, not necessarily all conflicts, but if we put efforts, there is a very good chance that we can resolve a good number of them. So for example, what are the locations of Nanda's Gokul and Vrindavan? And on that, I want to add something, because the next one is who discovered the locations of Nanda's Gokul and Vrindavan. We answered that. Okay, Vallabhacharya and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, respectively. When? About 500, 600 years ago. But the very first one, something very, very interesting. Whereas most of the people who commented on this Ranveer podcast were under the impression, and they were insisting, look, Gokul is different than Vrindavan and so on. And actually, that may be. I'm not saying that that is not correct. But I also want to point it out to you, and listen to this very carefully, that both Harivamsha and Bhagavad Puran does tell us at some point Nanda, Yashoda and his group changed their location within the Vraja from place A to B. And directionally, most of the people think, so the original place was called Gokul, and when they moved to Vrindavan. But is this really true? Well, maybe it is true, but there are sufficient references, including Bhagavad Puran itself, where the place where Vasudev took Krishna is called Gokul initially when he was born. But now listen to this very carefully. Afterwards, when Krishna was 7, they changed that location from one location to another. Okay. Now, when Krishna was 11, Kamsa is sending Akrura to go to the place of Nanda. I'm using my words with caution and care. I did not say Gokul or Vrindavan. To go to a place of Nanda and fetch Krishna and Balaram to Mathura. Now, when that indication is given, the word that is used to tell Akrura where to go and fetch Krishna and Balaram, the word uses also Gokul or Nanda Gokul. Okay, but if you consider the first place is Gokul and the second place is Vrindavan, then guys, read Bhagavad Puran again, because there Gokul and Vrindavan are used interchangeably. So I'm saying there is some confusion, there is some conflict, and yes, they can be resolved. The question is what you as an individual, or we as a cultural civilizational group, what we are willing to give up. Give up in the sense of, to resolve the issue, which of the arguments we think is weaker and therefore willing to drop. Otherwise, we will never resolve this conflict. But let me make a couple more points. In this particular case, it is, at least as far as the chronology is concerned, we do not have to resolve the conflict. I'm simply bringing you the nature of a conflict and what comes with it. Okay, because then what do we do with a Nanda Gram, which is way far away? And I'll come back to that in a second. And so the last point there is, last couple of points, did river Yamuna change its path? Many people suggested that. They said, Nilesh, you are doing a great work, but you are assuming today's Yamuna's path is the path that time 7,500 years ago. No, I'm not assuming anything, but in the absence of evidence, just because I need a river to go in a certain way, I'm not going to force the river to go that way. I'm going to look for evidence if it exists. So some people, or those people who feel passionate, guys, okay, get rid of your inertia, start researching. Look at the hydrology data, look at the morphodynamics of rivers data for Yamuna, look at the older map, look at some recent amazing technologies, satellite technology. See if you can find channels of Yamuna that go right now different from what Yamuna flows today, but possibly go between, say, Govardhan and Mathura. So Govardhan and Nadagaon on one side and Mathura on the other side. If you can find it, it may help us try to resolve this conflict in a more powerful way. And quickly, the last one. What is the critical point of mine in emphasizing all this discussion when I had a wonderful time with Ranveer on that podcast? Well, I wanted to emphasize the season when Krishna was born was early Grishma, the lunar month of Shravan, which means the lunar month of Shravan coincided with the early part of Grishma. Just so that you have a physical, climatological feel, I would say, think of the lunar month, think of the month of May in our times. And last one. Did Vasudev cross the river to me it's not relevant for specific points I was discussing. So if somebody wants him to cross the river, be my guest. If somebody is saying, well, it doesn't matter and he did not cross, be my guest. I'm okay with it. I was just giving the descriptions that are given in the Hari Vangsha or Bhagavad Puran. For example, in Hari Vangsha, there is no reference to anybody crossing Yamuna river, and therefore I mentioned it. All right. Okay, let me go back, and that will be the end of our discussion here, which is the additional challenge one may have is this. For example, I don't know what age, so that could be a good research for people to carry out. So first 7 years Krishna was in one place, whatever the place was, and then the next 4 years he was in another place. We, meaning most of the folks, take that as a yug. Gokul was the first place for first 7 years, and then Vrindavan, our current identification due to Vallabhacharya and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as the second place. In both places, kind of, I found this conflict, but especially with the Gokul, okay, which is to say, when if Krishna, especially the first 7 years, or Krishna doesn't have to be there, but what about the others, like the whole Nanda group? Were they taking cows across the river and then to Govardhan area to graze? Okay, that kind of looks like a tough proposal based on multiple things, such as, for example, going about 15, I forgot the distance now, 20 and 15, something like that, like 35 plus kilometers or something. Okay, so that's one challenge I saw. The second one is, if you remember the description, that Vasudeva was going along the bank of Ganga, and then he is seeing Govardhan. Okay, and of course he is only going to Mathura. Now my question, and I don't have the answer, but question to everyone. So what is the role of a Nandagaon? Okay, in that context, again, I'm not claiming I know the answer. I'm simply asking the question, what is the role of a Nandagaon? Okay, in that case. And so was it like a Nandagaon, maybe the initial place, and from there they could be bringing, again, still this is a lot of distance, 30 kilometers, to the Govardhan area. It could be this area, the foothills or something. Govardhan itself is not very tall to begin with. But then in that case, we have to ask the question, where is river Yamuna? Because it is far, far away from the physical location of Nandagaon, Barsana, or even Govardhan. Okay, so then the question comes, does that mean Yamuna was flowing differently than what it is flowing today, or was it, or therefore was it somewhere flowing such way that it was much closer to Govardhan, much closer to Nandagaon, and splitting, basically Govardhan, Nandagaon on one side and Krishna Janmashtami on another side? I'm just raising these questions for those who are very much into Krishna Bhakti and interested in Krishna's history and want to do further research. Like here, right there, I have given you some 10 ideas to work on. Okay, so with that, I want to stop. Let me see. Alrighty, and so that's it, guys. Please write your comments and let me know if we haven't resolved the conflicts, because unless we as an individual or as a team willing to compromise on something, willing to give up some of our dogma, we will not able to resolve this. But did it help you at least in understanding the complexity of the issue, even as simple as Gokul versus Vrindavan, and did Vasudeva cross river Yamuna to go to Gokul, and then the next day when Nanda is walking along the bank of river Yamuna, how come he was also in the area of a Govardhan? Okay, these are the interesting questions to ponder. And important to remember, we should never be in a hurry just for the sake of getting the answer. Satyena labhyas tapasa yesha atma. Okay, so ultimate our objective is very different, and to achieve that is the path of satya of anything, such as it could be the lifetimes of Krishna, the historical reality of Krishna, or a Mahabharat war. It could be about any subject. History is just one of the many. Okay, but that's important. And the second one is, we have to stay away from the jugaad just for the heck of it, just so that we become popular, we make some name, and we get the feeling of I also contributed. Okay, because satyameva jayate nanrutam. If we make a jugaad, and people have done it, okay, many Mahabharata dating researchers have done it, Ramayana dating researchers have done it. I am just referring to these because that's my area. And what happens? It comes to bite their backside. Okay, because at just for a few minutes they are successful in impressing a few bozos, but eventually it comes to bite, which also means it's a lesson for all of us, me included, is that we have to be always open to correct ourselves in the presence of additional or new evidence, new interpretation, new empirical data, and so on. Okay, so that's it, guys. Let me know what you think. Namaskar. I will see you soon in another episode with another interesting question, another interesting subject. Namaskar.